To Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. I hope you are having a good morning. Let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, at least 1,138 new coronavirus deaths and over 68,000 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. That means that over the past week, there has been an average of 64,396 cases per day, an increase of 17% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 30,485,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, while over 551,600 have died from it. Los Angeles County Public Health Director Barbara Ferrer said that based on numbers received from the federal government, Los Angeles will reach 80% vaccine coverage in residents over 16 years old in the next 12 weeks. This means that by the end of June, the county should have received through vaccinations and natural infections the 70 to 85% of immunity that's required for community immunity to the virus, also known as herd immunity. Community immunity is basically when you have enough people immune to a sickness, immune to a disease, that viral or infectious disease can't spread through it. There's just not enough oxygen for the fire, so to speak. India has said that it will begin vaccinating those over the age of 45 against the coronavirus, whether or not they have comorbidities. India has been vaccinating those over the age of 45 when they have one or more of 20 comorbidities so far, along with those aged 60 or over and all frontline and healthcare workers. They are opening it up now, though. More than 72,000 cases were reported in the last day, the highest daily figure since October. The head of the World Trade Organization says developed countries should either make enough doses for the whole world or give their research on COVID vaccines to developing countries. AstraZeneca has allowed India's Serum Institute to manufacture its vaccine at cost price. However, the vast majority of companies we see producing this stuff are doing it for profit. They're companies, but AstraZeneca, the one sort of notable exception to that. And I agree with the World Trade Organization. They should, if you have the recipe to create a vaccine, I understand it's proprietary, you spend money, you put research into it, but we're dealing with a global pandemic of, historic, once in a century like proportions. Just give up the damn vaccine already. Give up what, if you can't produce it for people, if you can't actually manufacture it, if you don't have resources to spare, I get it. That part is actually pretty expensive. But the recipe for it, the blueprint, give that away. Just do that. That's the right thing to do. Anyway. The World Health Organization has criticized the rollout of coronavirus vaccines in the European Union as unacceptably slow. Quote, vaccines present our best way out of this pandemic. Not only do they work, they are also highly effective in preventing infection. However, the rollout of these vaccines is unacceptably slow, end quote. That's according to the World Health Organization Regional Director for Europe, Dr. Hans-Henry P. Kluge. And this whole thing is a kludge, not to say he's to blame. If you've been following our show and specifically our coverage of the vaccine rollout in Germany, in the European Union, heck, in Germany specifically, just yesterday we had a conversation with Peter Oliver about the constant confusion, the going back and forth in terms of their policies, whether you're talking about the vaccine, specifically AstraZeneca, whether AstraZeneca is safe, whether they'll roll it out. They just restricted its use to those over the age of, I believe it was 60, either 60 or 65 in Germany. This was a joint announcement by Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel and its health minister Jens Spahn. They just restricted that after, the European Medicines Agency within the last couple of weeks said it was completely safe, said it was, very safe. And with the lockdowns, it's the same thing. They say there are going to be lockdowns, and then Merkel gets pushed back from regional governors, and she says there won't be lockdowns, and now there are going to be some lockdowns. And from what Peter Oliver was saying, people were actually broadly in favor of lockdowns. They want them. It's just they want clear directions on what they are and aren't allowed to do. At least that's what he was saying he saw and what he'd heard in his personal context there. Anyway, in national political news, back in the States here, the trial of Derek Chauvin was temporarily put on hold as a 61-year-old witness, Charles McMillian, broke down in sobs as he presented his version of Floyd's death from the witness stand. Jurors also heard yesterday from Christopher Martin, 19-year-old Cop Foods employee who first confronted Mr. Floyd about the apparently fake $20 bill that he had used to buy cigarettes. Martin said he quickly recognized that Mr. Floyd's $20 bill appeared to be fake. At the urging of his boss, Martin went outside and asked Floyd to pay or to come in and talk to the manager. Floyd refused, and eventually a manager asked another employee to call the police. Martin, again, the 19-year-old Cup Foods employee who had first confronted Floyd, said he regretted not just paying for it with his own $20, because after all, if he had done so, none of this would have happened. Floyd would still ostensibly be alive. That whole thing. Biden has taken his infrastructure plan on the road, starting with an address in Pittsburgh yesterday. Calling it the American Jobs Plan, the White House said that the once-in-a-century capital investment in U.S. infrastructure will create millions of good-paying jobs and allow America to outcompete China by spending about 1% of GDP per year over the course of 8 years. I don't know that this plan alone will allow us to outcompete China. I think it would take some more fundamental overhauls in our economic system, but that's what he said about it. The plan is set to cost about $2 trillion and will be presented alongside planned tax hikes on corporations. The key tenets of the plan include modernizing 20,000 miles of highway, repairing 10,000 small bridges and 10 economically significant bridges, those are larger ones, eliminating all lead pipes and drinking water systems, expanding access to high-speed broadband, and modernizing schools and upgrading veterans hospitals. The administration has said it intends to spend about $650 billion on revamping bridges and roads, $300 billion on housing infrastructure, $300 billion on reviving U.S. manufacturing, $400 billion on care for the elderly and disabled, and another $400 billion on clean energy credits. If you add all that up, as I just did, you get just over $2 trillion. You know, assuming no overlap, you get $2,050 billion. That's just over $2 trillion. There's also set in the bill a currently unspecified amount to be paid for broadband, water systems, and other measures. Jamarl, I know you've been looking at this, and I know for you, the sort of gold standard in American politics, at least, is what would FDR do? You know, that is, you can do too. You got to give it to me that you consistently bring that up. So with that as your frame here, what do you think of Biden's infrastructure bill?
So they keep using this argument of, excuse me, they keep using this argument of the tall, tiny person or tall, little person. Like, this is the first time in a generation, but that's not really saying much. It's like, hey, this tallest little person that we've dealt with up to this point was 3.5 feet. But now this guy's going to be 4 feet. Look, gaze upon the magnificence of his height. That's basically what we're being told, right? It's not that I hate it, and it's not that it doesn't do anything. That's never really the issue. The issue is whether it's doing something that is sufficient for the public, given what the public has encountered. That's the question. That's always the issue. If this guy gets a job at McDonald's, that's great, but is that job going to pay for his kid, pay for his house, pay for his mortgage, pay for the dog, pay for the car? Is he going to do all those things? And if he's not going to do all those things, then the $8 an hour is nice, but it's not necessarily sufficient for his needs. And the guy is not wrong for pointing out, hey, this isn't enough for my needs. Where other people are like, well, hey, buddy, you need to kind of just accept what you got. It's not, again, that the issue is wrong or bad. It's whether or not it's sufficient. And I keep pointing out, 500,000 people have died in 1 year. Like, think about that and lift that in the context of what Biden is doing and ask yourself whether it's sufficient. I mean, that's my gaze. That's my lens. All of these people have died. This was a direct result of malfeasance from the government. All of these businesses went bust. It was a direct result of malfeasance from the government. And the government, under Joe Biden, basically says, okay, here, take this. How about this? Is this enough? And my response is, you tell me, with 550,000 people dying over the course of a year as a result of the malfeasance of the government, is this sufficient? You tell me, Shane. What do you think?
I hear you. Well, I mean, here's what I think, man. You're talking about the pandemic, 550,000 some odd dead so far. I'll not too much less than that die on a daily basis from aging all around the world. And I know I'm not trying to dismiss the pandemic. What I'm saying here is, like, there are deep things that America could do. There's so much progress. I mean, you've watched Star Trek. There's so much progress that we could make on a global scale technologically in terms of what we could be doing with our planet, off our planet, to make this place a much better place to live, to improve the quality and span of lives around the world. And we need to do that research. But in order for there to be a sort of safe haven for that research, you need not just global stability, but locally productive environments where you can do R&D on those kinds of things. And, you know, it gets funding and it gets done well. We could be that country. We could be leading the way there. And I wish we were. And yet, when I think about Joe Biden or Donald Trump, any recent president really, but let's just take Joe Biden for a second, he's like a cherry Coke, Buddy Holly, 1950s, aggressively touching a girl behind the bleachers kind of a guy. He's not the kind of dude that would take us into the 23rd century. Not that we need to be there yet, but I think you get what I'm saying, Jamarl. And I wish we were headed there. I wish that we were looking into the future with justified optimism, boldly striving to go where no scientist has gone before, except not in a mad scientist kind of way. You get what I'm saying, though, Jamarl.
I get exactly what you're saying. We have a potential to do amazing things based on what we currently know and have. Like, even before you get into the uber technologies, with the technologies we have now and available, this world could be a paradise. Honest to God. I mean, think about it for the moment. Even if you're thinking about the technological development, we can make hyperloops. We can build things that get us from point A to point B across the world underwater as we're in these devices and we're going at these remarkable speeds, and kids are looking up, pointing out like, oh, look at the fish. That could be us.
That's the infrastructure I want. That is the infrastructure I want. That's the infrastructure we should have. And it's not like I trust our current government, the institutions that currently run it, to be able to build that kind of thing, because I don't. But you need to overhaul them. You need a leader who can do that. You need a leader who can, point the way, and not just one, but ideally many leaders to do that. Anyway, I mean, I don't want to just gaze up at the sky and wish we were there a little bit sooner, but that's kind of what I'm doing here. Back to the headlines. New Pentagon policies are set to allow openly transgender people to serve in the military. As of April 30th, the Pentagon says the rules will, quote, provide a path for those in service for medical treatment, gender transition, and recognition in one's self-identified gender, end quote. The announcement coincides with yesterday's International Transgender Day of Visibility. 4 people were killed, including a child, and 1 other was injured in a mass shooting at an Orange County office complex. Information about the suspect and their motive has not yet been released. In international news, Italy has expelled 2 Russian diplomats after an Italian naval officer was caught selling naval documents to an alleged Russian spy handler. Italy's foreign minister said it was an extremely serious matter. Russia, meanwhile, has said it would retaliate. We'll be talking about that, by the way, in a little bit with Alexander Mercouris later on in this hour at about 7:30 Eastern. Juan Antonio Hernandez has been sentenced to life for drug trafficking and ordered to forfeit just over $138 million. These are for crimes of distributing 185 tons of cocaine. You heard that right. Purchasing firearms illicitly, engaging in large-scale bribery. It's also said that he's complicit in at least 2 murders. Juan Antonio is the brother of the current Honduran president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, also widely thought to be involved in drug trafficking and the subject of an ongoing investigation by U.S. prosecutors. The country of Yemen has received its first shipment of COVID-19 vaccines. 1/3 of a million AstraZeneca doses arrived at the southern port of Aden. The AstraZeneca vaccines will, quote, enable health workers and other priority populations vulnerable to COVID-19 to be protected against the virus, end quote. That's according to UNICEF in a statement yesterday. The first batch is part of 1.9 million doses that Yemen will receive throughout 2021. A court in Hong Kong has found 7 individuals guilty of taking part in an unauthorized protest 2 years ago, including the entrepreneur and media tycoon Jimmy Lai and the veteran politician Martin Lee. A French newspaper has accused China's state media of inventing a journalist to argue that there are no human rights abuses in Xinjiang. That investigation it was kicked off in the French media. And again, they're basically saying there is no French journalist at the center of this. I want to come back to that. I was just reading about that this morning, just hearing about that this morning. I believe that Jamarl, I'm going to be off tomorrow, but I believe you're speaking with Ian Goodrum, and maybe he'll have a vantage on this one. He is one of our resident China experts.
Yeah.
The ICC yesterday upheld the 2019 acquittal of the Ivory Coast's former president Laurent Gbagbo, who remains an influential figure in the country. Prosecutors had argued that grave errors were made by war crimes judges, finding that they failed to prove their case against Gbagbo. Gbagbo had faced charges of crimes against humanity for his alleged role in post-election violence in the Ivory Coast in 2010 and 2011. And we need to close it here. Those were our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan, and we will be back in a minute with our soapbox segment, Jamarl's monologue, and a short back and forth on a topic of his choice. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. What do we want? news, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also join in on the conversation with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I am still talking about Joe Biden's press conference because it was a big event. It's this extreme event considering what else is taking place, because things that Joe Biden said in the press conference still affect things now. And some of those things are really interesting to me, especially this thought that Biden is doubling down on imperialism and the media is helping him do so. It is apparent to anybody that is watching this. And fact of the matter is, if you can't name a mistake, if you can't denote your failings and your failures, if you can't say, this is where we messed up, and this, correcting this, is the thing that's going to prevent us from hitting our head on this particular mistake later on. Name names, shame the devil. Can't do that. And the fact that we can't do that and won't do that gets across that nothing is going to fundamentally change. Those kids that are showing up at the border are basically our karma. It's almost like our kids. It's like you went around, you plant your seed, and then a few years later, somebody is at your door saying, "Are you my daddy?" And they're holding a thing saying, "Mama sent me here." I know that's not exact, but it is kind of similar, right? If our foreign policy had something to do with the catastrophes in other countries, and those kids show up at our border, I would say it is exponentially karmic in regards to its implications, despite the fact that we will say, "Kid, I'm not your daddy." On some level, we kind of are. Jen Psaki one time said, in response to Vladimir Putin pushing back against Joe Biden, calling him a killer, that the United States learns from its mistakes, and we improve upon those mistakes after we learn from them. Not so much. Let's play this clip. Joe Biden is being asked, when can people see the facilities? And Joe Biden basically says, you'll see them when we're done. Let's play the clip, because he couldn't maintain this.
I'd like to circle back to immigration, please. You just listed the reasons that people are coming, talking about in-country problems, saying that it happens every year. You blamed the last administration. Sir, I just got back last night from a reporting trip to the border where I met 9-year-old Josel, who walked here from Honduras by himself, along with another little boy. He had that phone number on him, and we were able to call his family. His mother says that she sent her son to this country because she believes that you are not deporting unaccompanied minors like her son. That's why she sent him alone from Honduras. So, sir, you blame the last administration, but is your messaging in saying that these children are and will be allowed to stay in this country and work their way through this process, encouraging families like Josel's to come?
Well, look, the idea that I'm going to say, which I would never do, if an unaccompanied child ends up at the border, we're just going to let him starve to death and stay on the other side.
Joe Biden is basically not going to take a step that is going to send the kid back. That is commendable from the standpoint of ethics. By the same token, why is that kid there in the first place? And is it possible that if we cared a little bit more about ethics, that that kid wouldn't be there? That the end result choice that Joe Biden has to make is going to be bad all the way around because there's no good choice at that point. Let's take a listen to the other clip for a moment. Because Joe Biden is basically arguing, look, I'll let you see this when we are done. And up until the point where we're done, I'm not going to let anybody come in to see the facilities. Well, when those facilities were seen on Tuesday, horrors. I mean, you had facilities that were 1,000% overbooked in regards to the number of people that were, or the number of kids that were laying on those floors. And keep in mind, many of those kids had COVID, and they're not testing until the symptoms are being shown, which means that COVID, because of the way the kids are packed in, could be spread through the facilities. Let's play this one last clip. This is the reason that Biden is given for them escaping.
You just listed the reasons that people are coming, talking about in-country problems, saying that it happens every year. You blamed the last administration. Sir, I just got back last night from a reporting trip to the border where I met 9-year-old Josel, who walked here from Honduras.
Let's kill that one, but it
along
is
with another little boy. He had that phone number on him.
Yeah, but it is notable.
We were able to call his family.
Yeah, it is notable. I mean, Biden is arguing basically that it's gangs, it's earthquakes, it's floods, etc. But what Biden is not saying is America. American foreign policy is a thing that Joe Biden couldn't name. And think about what that means for the moment. If you can't name U.S. foreign policy in regards to the drug laws that we're making, the drugs that we're using, or for that matter, the coups that we're instigating, then what does that mean going forward? Think about what I'm saying. If Joe Biden and the media is concerned about all of the migrants showing up at the border, it's all of this consternation. Oh my God, these migrants, they keep showing up. Please stay where you are, stay where you are. Fair enough. But if you're going to have that much consternation, shouldn't you care about the actual reasons on some level of why the people are there? Let's go with Honduras, the one that was mentioned for the moment. Honduras, Joe Biden and the United States, when Clinton was in office, gets rid of Zelaya and doesn't necessarily let Zelaya come back in regards to our typical foreign policy of not backing coups. Well, that coup that took place created a basket case of a country of Honduras where drugs were ensconced in that society. Gangs resulted and were ensconced in that society. And so when we're talking about the kids that are showing up, on some level, they're trying to escape a policy that we help instigate, that put that country on fire. And it's not just Honduras. The media can never bring up that. The media can never ask the question, hey, was it a good idea that you assisted in getting rid of the president of that particular country in regard and within a coup, and putting that in a basket case? And if that didn't turn out well for us because of the 80% of the drugs that go through Honduras, then maybe we don't want to continue that policy. But the problem is recent as Bolivia, within a couple of years prior, you had Evo Morales being escorted out, assisted, strongly believed by the United States, using the OAS as a tool of regime change. Lula da Silva gets put in a cage in in Brazil, as a result of U.S. intervention. It's very clear that the U.S. was involved in getting rid of da Silva, somebody who they didn't particularly like. Same thing with Dilma Rousseff. They didn't put her in a cage, but they definitely got her out of government. What about Venezuela? Right now, we are pretending that Juan Guaido is president or is in charge of that country. It is laughable and it is ludicrous. The man tried to have a violent coup. Nobody came out short of 1 or 2 military vehicles. They were arrested. And Guaido, if Venezuela gets its hands on him, is going to be put in a cage for basically treason and traitorous behavior all around. Nicaragua, for example, El Salvador, and the kill squads that were pushed by our policies in that country. I am making the point that how do you look at U.S. foreign policy? I mean, even the coups propagated by the CIA, the people that were being shot, you had situations where we were trying to entice people, and the people that couldn't necessarily be brought onto our ends in places like Guatemala and Chile. These people were being killed. In one case, CIA bombed one of the buildings or the capitals, and on top of all of this, in some cases, violent despots being put into these countries because it is easier to work with the despot. I'm making the point that if Joe Biden and the media is going to look at the situation and the thing that they're going to leave out is our instantiation to those countries, our will, our policy into those countries, then you are lying. Not just lying, you're ignoring the things that is causing those countries to be in the conditions that those countries are in. And if you can't say it now, you can't say it at all. Meaning you're not trying to change anything. What you want is the magical solution of having the foreign policy that you want instigating itself into affairs of other nations, and you don't want those other nations to notice or to mind. This is kind of like the comically ridiculous policy towards Iran. Yes, we're going to instigate a coup. Yes, we're going to put in a strongman. Yes, we're going to put sanctions and everything else. But you shouldn't have any issue with that. And if you get angry and scream death to America, then we're going to be very angry at you for doing that. Or for China, we're going to pass all of these sanctions. We're going to say you commit genocide. But the moment that you respond to that and pass your own sanctions, we're going to be outraged. We're going to take umbrage with that. How dare you? If Joe Biden and the mainstream media can't honestly assess why all of these migrants are coming to our border, then that means they're not changing anything. And the policy with Evo, the policy with Da Silva, the policy with Honduras, even the policy with Ecuador, the policy with Venezuela, the policy with Nicaragua, those things have consequences. Pretending that they don't gets across that there's no changing that's taking place. This notion that we learn from our mistakes, nonsense. We keep on plugging in this direction. Shane, what are your thoughts, man? I don't see any honest reflection on this issue at all, and yet the migrants are going to keep coming.
No, because I think it still keeps working. I mean, I think that that's the perception in DC. What would it take to break that perception down? And I don't mean to just pin it right back on you or turn it right back around, but this is what, this is in some sense the question. How do you burst the bubble? What would it take? What kind of event would it take? Would it take us losing a war? Would that work? Would that be either sufficient or necessary? Or could we do it without getting to that point? I think that is the real question. You get where I'm going. What do you think, Jamarl?
I get exactly where you're going. And yes, I think it takes something that is painful in order to get that behavior to change. Because otherwise, there's no reason to change behavior. Like right now, there's no honest assessment about the migrants coming to the border. They're just saying, oh, the countries are basket cases. Oh, there's floods, there's hurricanes, there, whatever. And they don't deal with this notion that you're putting sanctions on countries, for one. The guy in Honduras, we're acting like the guy's a partner when he's talking about trying to shove cocaine into the nose of pretty much every gringo, as it's called. And none of these things are serving us. Evo Morales was fantastically great at getting wins in that country for the population. It didn't matter. They wanted to get rid of him. Lula was great for the gains of the population. Didn't matter. They wanted to get rid of him. They weren't tools for us. And so the question becomes, like you say, how do you change that policy? And until there's an honest regard for why, I don't think you can change it. Like until the media says, this is why this is happening, and the public is outraged. Whoa, we've been doing that into the other countries? Then nothing changes, nothing happens. They just keep going with this notion that it's somebody else's fault. They keep coming here because it's somebody else's fault. I think that's ludicrous.
Yeah, but for the public to get that, the media would need to be sufficiently in on it. The media would suddenly need to have an incentive. They need to be able to break that open, because right now they won't, because they want to retain access and they want to keep their good graces with the powers that be, who again not only give them access but give them freedom to breathe and freedom to move as journalists. They do not want to lose that. And that's what it would take for the public to suddenly become aware of all this stuff. And if the public were made aware, I'll put it like this: if Fox News and NBC started talking about our coups in South America, if that were for whatever reason, if for like a month or a couple of months, that became the big public news item, I don't see it happening, but go with me for a second. then the public would be all up in arms about it. Like A to B. If both sides of the media were to make people aware of it and talk about it consistently, well, then naturally the public would turn against it, because that's how propaganda works in our era, and probably in any era in a society like ours. That's not going to happen, but that's the kind of thing you would need to happen to have a deep change in our policy. And I don't even think that would be enough, because there are deeper things that would prevent that from happening. You'd have to have the government want to change its course, probably. You'd need some new media ecosystem. We talk about all this stuff all the time, and we're trying to figure out where is the thin edge of the wedge. What do you have to break open? What's the way to get us to change our behavior on this larger scale? We need to come back to it some other time, though. We've got to go into a break. We will be back in a minute with Alexander Marcouris talking about the relationship between Russia and Europe, a meeting between Putin, Macron, and Merkel, and this deal with the Italians expelling the 2 Russian diplomats over allegations that the Italian naval officer was selling naval information to a Russian spy handler. Anyway, we're going to be talking about this with Alexander Marcouris on the other side of this short break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones, with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about the various back and forth political and diplomatic policies between members of the European Union and the Russian Federation specifically. Let's start with Emmanuel Macron of France, Angela Merkel of Germany, and Vladimir Putin of the Russian Federation. Their virtual meeting a couple of days ago on Tuesday, where they were discussing possible cooperation on vaccines, with Putin potentially coming in to sell them the Sputnik V vaccine. This, of course, as Europe has had an extremely and apparently increasingly hard time procuring the vaccines they so desperately need in order to start to get their population on the upswing towards wider immunity and really staving off this virus in the long haul. For this conversation, we are joined by Alexander Marcouris. He is the editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You can follow Alexander on YouTube on his channel, Alexander Marcouris. You can also watch The Duran on YouTube, and you should check out their website, theduran.com. Alexander, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning? Or afternoon, your time, I should say.
With you, and always a pleasure, and excited to be on your program.
It is always great to have you, and thank you for coming on so frequently, Alexander. Really appreciate your perspective on a lot of these issues. Let's get back into that meeting that I was talking about. We've been speaking recently and regularly about the problems in the EU with vaccine procurement, specifically at issue, that probably most at issue, is the AstraZeneca vaccine, which in Germany, Angela Merkel and Jens Spahn, the Chancellor and Health Minister of Germany, respectively, restricted to those over the age of, I believe it was 60. Could have been 65, but I believe it was 60. And basically over allegations that the AstraZeneca vaccine had a much higher risk of inducing blood clots than they were comfortably willing to permit to the public. This, however, leaves a big question. Okay, if not AstraZeneca, then what? They're trying to get Pfizer-BioNTech's vaccine into a much higher pace of production, with the idea that that could lead to some wider rollout, but that's going slow. There aren't that many options. And so naturally, you have the Sputnik V vaccine, which Russia has been offering to many, many countries around the globe. And so far, they are reticent to take it. In fact, Slovakia's prime minister stepped down just a couple of days ago after a scandal had mounted over his acceptance of that vaccine without the permission of EU authorities or apparently the rest of Slovakia's political system. He stepped down because he took in a vaccine, which, again, if Macron and Merkel take it, in my opinion, it's a bit silly for one lowly leader in the European Union to have to step down when, France and Germany could decide to take it at a moment's notice. And if they do so, it will certainly make that decision look, in my opinion, a bit bad politically. But anyway, I want to get your take. Alexander, what do you think of these events? What do you think is going to happen here? And what does this actually mean in the relationship between Europe and Russia? Will the United States decide to get involved if they accept the vaccine from Russia? What's your take?
I think if the Europeans decide to take the Sputnik V vaccine, there's very little the US can do, but the US won't be happy. I mean, the US put pressure on Brazil not to take Sputnik V, so you can imagine how they'll feel if their European allies do so. The British, by the way, are absolutely livid about this call, this meeting between Putin, Merkel and Macron on Tuesday. The British media are very angry about it. They insist that the AstraZeneca vaccine is completely safe. They point out that it's been licensed by the European Medicines Authority. They point out that Sputnik V still hasn't been, and they feel that, they feel betrayed and very angry towards the Europeans. But as you absolutely rightly said in your introduction, what realistic choice do the Europeans have? The Pfizer vaccine isn't available in sufficient quantities, and even if the Europeans now were to carry out a massive U-turn and endorse AstraZeneca, many Europeans would be extremely worried about taking it because of all the health scares that surround it. So I'm not here myself to say which vaccine is good and which is not. But the simple fact of the matter is that it's going to be impossible now to persuade much of the European public to accept it. So given that that is so, the only real option, the only other game in town, in effect, is Sputnik V. So they have to talk to Putin. Now, Russia has had production issues with Sputnik V. They were not a major vaccine producer until last year. They've now put all their resources into sorting out the vaccine production issues within Russia itself. It seems that production in Russia is now starting to take off on a big enough scale, not just to cover Russia itself, but also to provide sufficient doses for export. And it may be that we're going to start to see Sputnik V reach Europe, but I expect that's going to take some weeks or months, even if every sort of bridge is crossed, every line is everything's sorted out to achieve that, because starting production of Sputnik V in Europe would apparently take quite a long time to do. So they'd have to import it from Russia, and that would take time. And remember, it hasn't yet been licensed. The most likely time that would be in May.
It's just profound to me that the foreign policy or that the politics of it matter more than the lives of the people in the country. I'm astounded by that. They're acting like there's some special Russian science or some special Chinese science that is just different than the science that America practices. It's nonsense. Your population in the context of the UK or in the context of Europe is dying. They're not able to keep up from the standpoint of the vaccines that they have at their disposal. Russia and China have vaccines that are available if indeed this was a world that we were sharing these items. And yet, because of foreign policy concerns, I mean, we did the same thing to Brazil in the Health and Human Services report. They bragged about trying to get Brazil not to take the Chinese or the Russian vaccine. It's astonishing. I mean, and this is talking about a country that has like 300,000 deaths. It's astonishing, that's all.
This is absolutely right. And to give you an idea of how crazy it is and how visceral now the hatred of Russia and of everything Russian has become, bear in mind that back in the 1960s and 1970s, the West worked with the then Soviet Union to eliminate smallpox. And that meant accepting vast amounts of Soviet smallpox vaccine. Soviets were very, very good at producing a vaccine to eliminate smallpox, and they actually suggested the plan to eradicate smallpox. And nobody at that time worried or was concerned about the fact that much of this vaccine was coming from the Soviet Union, because everybody understood at that time, and we're talking about the Cold War, that eliminating smallpox and saving lives was the priority. But coming back to your point at the beginning of the program, the real worry is the obsession that you have with all these people who play geopolitics in Washington, in London, in Paris, to some extent in Berlin too, is that if the Russians are able to sell their vaccine in the West, then of course Westerners' perspective of Russia will begin to change. They'll be starting to say to themselves, well, perhaps the Russians are actually quite an advanced country after all. After all, they're able to produce vaccines. Maybe they're not the terrible place we're always been told about. Maybe we owe them a debt of gratitude because their vaccines are saving us, and we start feeling differently towards them. Given the extraordinary lengths the British government took 3 years ago to stop British tourists, British football supporters, going to Moscow to attend the World Cup, the Football World Cup that took place in that year. That gives you a sense of how important this has become. The last thing they want, I think, is to allow European populations to start forming a view of Russia which is a positive one. And when I say the last thing, they are prepared to sacrifice hundreds of thousands, millions even, of people, it would seem, in order to preserve this negative image of Russia so that they can persist with their geopolitical strategies and their goal of whatever that is, because I think we're now beginning to find it increasingly difficult to work out what it is, even though that was not the tactic they followed during the Cold War itself, as we saw with smallpox.
There's a principle in cognitive psychology that basically people are often more reticent to give up something they have acquired than to seek it out in the first place. In other words, if you have something, you're afraid of losing it, and you will try to keep it to all ends, even if that means sacrificing more important things to keep it. And this comes to mind for me because, again, what you're just talking about, to restate something you just said, you're talking about how during the Cold War, we were more willing to work with Russia. The international community was more willing to work with Russia on the smallpox vaccine than we are now, when ostensibly we're not in a Cold War, when we're, there are heightened tensions between different countries, but nevertheless, we're not pitted against each other in an existential conflict. And what comes to mind for me, especially based on what you were saying towards the end there, is that we have acquired, the United States specifically, some international supremacy, some hegemony, to use that word, militarily, economically, on different fronts. And now that we have acquired it, we are more reticent than we ever were to give it up. And this, again, is a sort of hidden hand operating in the international political system, despite the fact that on the surface, by what the State Department puts out in its dispatches, we're not the leader of the world. We're just the leader of the free world, and even then, not in a sort of managerial sense, more in a moral prerogative sense. That seems to me to be wrong, and this seems to be giving the lie away when it comes to our actual position. We need to go to a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined by Alexander Mercouris, and we will be back with him on the other side of this break. He is the editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You can follow him on YouTube at Alexander Mercouris. You should also check out the Duran on YouTube and on their website, theduran.com. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with Alexander on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak: The Deadliest Epidemics in Human History, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. With all of the talk about the vaccines, especially with all of the back and forth within the context of Europe dealing with these vaccines, there is going to be political calamity that you can just kind of imagine springing out of this. One of those countries has to do with France, with far-right leader Marine Le Pen breaking even with one Emmanuel Macron. Now, the elections are not scheduled until April of 2022. By the same token, Le Pen is basically saying that she is going with a France first policy. And you can imagine, in an era where there seems to be this kind of consternation on vaccines, that France first policy may actually carry water this time around. To have a conversation, we're joined with Alexander Macaris. He's editor-in-chief at the Duran, and honestly, one of my favorite guests. Alexander, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us again.
My pleasure.
So, France is having an election in 2022, and I would imagine with all of the, let's say, failures associated with the European Union and the vaccine, all of the fights that have been taking place over the vaccines, that an argument of France first may actually carry a lot more weight in this political climate. So what are your thoughts with this? I mean, 2022, what are Marine Le Pen's chances this time around?
I think they look stronger at the moment than they've ever done. I must qualify that by saying that France is an unproducible country. She still has an enormous amount of opposition in France. There are many, many people who will never vote for her and who will support anybody, basically, to stop her becoming president of France, because French history is such that a leader like that from the far right is always going to meet immense resistance in France. But having said that, the situation is starting to move to her advantage. And you said why? Because Macron's economic policies have not been popular. And, of course, the economic situation in France is now very difficult. France is now back in lockdown. Many people are blaming Macron for all of this because they say that he hasn't managed the coronavirus situation in France well. And there's growing disapproval and unhappiness about the EU and its failures with its vaccine rollout also. Bear in mind that France is an unusual country in Europe. It has traditionally been strongly nationalistic. It has always tended to pursue, in the past, a France-first policy. That was very much de Gaulle's approach. De Gaulle always saw the European Union as something that France could use to its advantage, but certainly he never imagined France, if you like, becoming submerged in EU institutions. So, in a way, there is a kind of French nationalist, France first tradition that Marine Le Pen has always been able to tap into. But now that policy seems to be gaining traction with the French as it hasn't done before because of these mounting problems that Macron hasn't been able to cope with, and because of his distance, his aloofness from the French people, which I've witnessed myself.
And for Le Pen, she has denied that she is far right. She's sort of denigrated the use of that term to describe her. How would you characterize her politics and her policies, Alexander?
Well, she is very right. Can I say straight away? I've always said she is very similar in her political views to de Gaulle. De Gaulle was a French nationalist He didn't want immigration into France. He spoke very critically about immigration. It's an aspect of his personality and his policies which isn't well remembered. He was very much somebody who was very concerned about preserving French culture, which he saw very much in the French Christian tradition. I mean, he was all of that played a part. And of course, like Marine Le Pen, he wanted good relations with Russia, the Soviet Union as it was then, and he was rather skeptical about the United States and about Britain also. So I think she is pretty right-wing. I don't think she's that different from de Gaulle. I think people who compare her with the more fascistic tendencies that, by the way, most certainly do exist in France, are underestimating, if you like, the extent of her opportunism and the degree to which she's able to modify her positions. She is not, I think, quite as extreme right as the original Le Pen, her uncle was, who created the party. And, of course, she is not like Poujade, who led the extreme right after the Second World War, who was essentially a Vichy loyalist, a supporter of the Vichy, which had been the collaborationist government during the Second World War. And, of course, she is most definitely not the even further right, like the Action Française, which had existed before the Second World War, which was a straightforwardly ultra-right-wing fascistic party in the 1930s. She's not quite that far, but on that spectrum, she is certainly to the right of French politics as they have functioned since the 1970s, since de Gaulle parted the scene. I should say, by the way, that there's a great deal of misunderstanding of de Gaulle, because de Gaulle, left the scene in the 1960s. People tend to remember him differently from how he was. And, of course, there was a lot of opposition to de Gaulle in France, both in the 50s and in the 60s, because he was perceived as extremely right-wing. He was also, by the way, a person who had very interventionist economic policies and had undoubtedly an authoritarian streak. So I would say that she's very much in his tradition rather than that of, the ultra-right, neo-fascist right that has existed in France. But it's important not to misunderstand what she is and to imagine that she's some sort of a liberal figure either. She's certainly not that.
And one other component of de Gaulle's policies that hasn't been included so far, that hasn't been explicitly put to the forefront of the conversation, is his opposition to the United States intervention in Vietnam, our war on Vietnam, as well as the supremacy of the American dollar as a reserve currency, which he called an exorbitant privilege. The idea that it is very good for us, and he was in opposition to that. Possibly the most notable leader on the international scene to be in opposition to that. Would Le Pen carry those policies on, Alexander, or do you think not? What's your take?
I don't know, because of course the thing about Le Pen is that she's also extremely ambitious. She very much wants to be president. She's possibly not going to be quite as vigorous in pursuing some of the things that she's talked about that as people think she is. And to be straightforward about it, I don't think she has anything like the force of personality and the authority that de Gaulle did. But you're quite right. I mean, de Gaulle was opposed to U.S. policies, waging war in Vietnam. He was very strongly opposed to those sort of things. De Gaulle, wanted a France divested of its colonial empires, partly because he didn't want a France contaminated, if you like, by the nationalities that existed in those empires. He wanted Algeria free from France so that Algerians wouldn't come to France. He actually talks in that way, a fact people are not aware of, because there's a lot about de Gaulle's foreign policy that people approve of, and because there's a lot about de Gaulle's domestic economic policies they approve of, they tend to forget that side of things. My sense is that an actual President, Le Pen, will be closer to de Gaulle on some of those domestic policies that I'm talking about, restricting immigration and that sort of thing, than she really will be standing up to the US on foreign policy questions. I think she senses that doing that will get her into serious trouble with the US, and she doesn't have the political weight or authority that de Gaulle had in order to achieve it. Of course, also, de Gaulle believed in what he was doing to the extent that Le Pen does. Well, I'm not so sure.
What about Europe? Even though she may not necessarily have the, let's say, the weight or the gravitas in order to, let's say, stand up against the United States, France and the people of France, I suspect, would back her in pushing back against the EU. Or am I wrong on that? Like, I get this feeling that, I mean, people were talking about Frexit at one point. France tend to be very, let's say, understanding of its own weight and sovereignty within the context of Europe. Would France back her and being, let's say, more nationalistic in regards to her perspective in pushing back against elements of the European Union?
I think it would, actually. Now, of course, Le Pen has, again, watered down her EU policies. I mean, she says that she now accepts the euro, for example, which she at one point indicated that she would take France out of. But I am sure that in order to keep her electoral base united behind her, she would take a much more assertive line towards the EU than say, Macron has. I mean, it's inconceivable she would say what Macron regularly does, which is that the solution to France's problems is more Europe. I mean, it's impossible to imagine Le Pen ever saying something like that, because if she did, I mean, frankly, her political position would collapse. So she will be more assertive within the EU. She will have a more difficult relationship with Germany, because obviously she also taps into that traditional French resentment and suspicion of Germany, which, if you scratch below the surface, is very much there still in France. I should say I know France quite well. I used to live there. So all of that she's going to play to, and if she becomes president, she will certainly be more assertive in defending French interests. And